And I think this is an interesting discussion, and appreciate the comments from my colleagues about how we're prioritizing and what the issues are that we're considering. And obviously, efficiency is important, but I'm interested in this conversation about the metrics that we value. And coming from Houston, a city that's fairly new, I personally walk around Washington and wonder at the incredible architectural value of these buildings that we work in, and that we get to come to work in these buildings every day. And I think there is a value that we place on the facilities in Washington and around the country with some of the older facilities. So certainly I'm more interested in the metrics that we can look at besides age, and also the improvements that we can make. And so I was interested in the conversation about what are the things that we can do to make our buildings more energy efficient when we recognize that there's a value. Certainly I don't think anyone's suggesting that we wouldn't keep the buildings that we're currently in. But the discussion about, looking at the envelope, looking at the windows, or doing some simple things like, sealing at the exterior of the building. I think what would be helpful to us is a sense of what are the other metrics we can look at as a shorthand for, the idea of whether we're in leased buildings and getting out of those makes sense to me. But as we're evaluating these assets, knowing where we can make improvements, I think would be a useful factor. And one thing I want to ask specifically, one of you mentioned the cost of an effort in improving and replacing the existing systems, the mechanical heating and cooling systems. So recently there was a survey that was supposed to come out, a study in September that came out in May from the National Institute of Standards and Technology on the economic and environmental benefits of gas versus electricity in homes. And I'd be interested in kind of your thoughts and feedback on increasing the use of natural gas in some of these buildings versus electric, if that's one of the things when we're talking about replacing existing systems where you see room for improvement.
Thank you, Congresswoman. And I have to note that Texas is one of the top states for LEED in 2018, the number 5, very good. So I do want to point that LEED has a system for existing buildings to provide a way to approach these buildings, which can be more challenging to bring up to highly performing energy and water efficiency, indoor air quality. And GSA does have experience with that system. For example, here in DC, there's the Treasury Building, an iconic historic structure that achieved LEED Gold in 2011 and has been reported at saving about $3.5 million a year in utility costs. So that's a good success story. We favor and encourage a whole building approach that looks at all of the systems, the envelope, in combination with the needs, what are the user's needs for the building, and make sure that those are aligned, and then create a structured plan to implement the improvements that are needed. That may include gas, it may include electric, it's really site-specific. It may also depend on resiliency goals and the grid and the vulnerabilities of that location. So these are all considerations for dealing with existing buildings and improving them over time.
Thank you.
I would like to offer one answer to 2 parts of your question each. So in terms of what other metrics we might be considering, one that I think would be a great start is looking at how a building is occupiable when there is no power. So how much of the floor area is daylighted and has access to outside air? So many of our buildings, if there's no power, we have to leave them, and this is tragic. The other is a technology. You asked about what technologies in particular for existing buildings, and I'll offer one that continues to bear fruit, which is lighting. There's some new innovations with what's called luminaire level lighting control that I think can start to stitch together some of our conversations today. One around it can help reduce energy consumption substantially by having a distributed sensor network of occupancy and daylight harvesting sensors on each light fixture. It's a retrofit technology, and you can start to understand your space utilization because each sensor triggers when a person walks by and it knows how occupied or unoccupied certain spaces would be. And it might help with the space prioritization. Thank you.
Thank you.
If I can offer Green Globes also does an existing building program. But one of the things that we do that works really well relative to your question is with the guiding principles compliance, it actually requires when you're doing evaluations to do what's called life cycle assessment and determine, does it make sense? Just because you may have a certain efficiency HVAC system and there's a newer efficiency one that comes out, doesn't mean you need to immediately replace that. You need to look at the overall cost of it and determine what is going to make the best sense for the operational cost, overall long-term efficiency of that. And so when doing that analysis to determine the best thing, we always recommend to our clients, do that analysis. What's the lifespan? What's the operating cost that's going to come out of that? What's your new upfront cost to determine what's the best way to proceed?
Thank you very much. I see I've gone over, so I will yield back. Thank you, Madam Chairwoman.